I'll have 2 recordings. Okay. All right. Sorry, y'all. Thanks, Amber. All right. Back to screen share. Great. So I was just sharing about where all this work is coming from. Lots of different places, lots of different people. But, really patterns that I've been seeing really working at the intersections of healing, justice, and spirituality. So as we kind of touched on earlier, systems of oppression decenter liberatory approaches in leadership, and this leads to high rates of burnout, overwhelm, ineffective campaigns, a revolving door for people of color, surface relationships, and high levels of physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional duress. So I'm sure many of you have experienced this within your organizations, within your groups and networks. And in my work over this past period of time, I've really asked this question of like, how are folks able to stay in the work long-term? And what are people relying upon? And I want to go to the outer edge first of this, kind of like a triangle. And the first thing is community. And so that was really prevalent in the examples that folks gave in terms of like connection with others. Community is absolutely vital. And like a culture of community is also absolutely essential in order for organizations and organizing projects and campaigns to be successful, and for us to really feel out of isolation and in connection with each other. So communities of care and support hold us and grow us. They're opportunities for us to form, gather, and grow deeper. And they, they're containers. They're the ground that really holds us. It's why it matters that we do the work. Like, it's not for ourselves. It's for ourselves in relationship to other people. The second prong here on the bottom is earth and or spirit. And, if you're not a spiritual person, then you can just land on the earth part of it. If you are, then you can land in both areas. But the earth provides us so much information to how we can sustain, right? When there's a forest fire, a natural forest fire, like that happens naturally in order for new growth to bloom open and on the forest floor, and new trees to grow. And oftentimes in our human burnout cycles, we don't take the time for that to happen. Like, we feel like, oh, we burnt out and that was a fail on our part, right? But if we look to earth for the rhythms and the ways that the seasons work, and also just holistic processes, there's something that's called biomimicry, which is really the study of Earth's processes and how we can really learn from them to address and apply to our social problems. When we look to the natural world, we find so many answers for the problems that we humans continue to grapple with. And then spirit, connection to something greater than our human form, which also can be, in the form of earth, which is greater than us as human beings. And that can be, love, can be a relationship with God, Buddha, Allah, etc. Whatever it is, source, something greater than ourselves. And then the other one over here is the imagination. And I touched on that really briefly. But the imagination is, again, and Adrienne Maree Brown talks a lot about how the imagination that we live out right now in the world is the imagination of a white supremacist culture, but we're not really fully living into the imagination of what could be beyond that. I'm not saying across the board. We're imagining all the time. And, I just recently was at the Mystic Soul Project and was reflecting with Amber, who's on the call right now, and with Liberatory Leadership Project. And so much of that space, which was a people of color centered space where spirit was really centered, and art and culture and love and all of that was just a huge imaginatory project of just what could it really look like to create a contemplative Christianity that is not about replicating systems of oppression of just white hetero men at the leadership. What would it look like if it was completely young people of color, queer, non-binary, etc. And that was really actualized in that space. So we seek social changes not yet attained. And in order to know where we're going, we must nourish and connect to the imagination, because this allows us to step into the generative, powerful vision forward. So these are the three things on the outside that are really ways to strengthen our resilience and ways that hold us in resiliency. This connection with people, this connection with our communities, earth, inner spirit, and the imagination. And when we're in a place of burnout, when we're in a place of overwhelm, like we have less access oftentimes to these places. And like I said earlier in the call, this work is trauma work, and yet we often don't treat it as such. And so if it's trauma work, then how can we show up to it differently? Unfortunately, many of our organizations and our organizing projects and, you know, even healing organizations often don't address it, again, as trauma work or with the care and attention needed to really be sustained, because we're, again, replicating the systems of oppression like internally. So a capitalistic model that's asking us to produce, and that you're only what you produce. You're only worthy of, you know, worth what you produce. A system that has very little attention on relationships and much more on the product or, you know, what's being done, and not the how that it's being done. And the how is where we go to the middle of the circle, and that's action and practice. And those really go together, because oftentimes in our organizing work and our social justice movements, we're really good at the action part, maybe not so great at the practice part. And then in our healing and spiritual communities, oftentimes we're really good at the practice part and not so great at the action part. So these are really, there's something we can really learn from this intersection of spirituality, healing, and justice. And that's practice and action, right? So you need both. So practice is, you know, cultural, individual, spiritual, or community forms of renewal practice, such as ritual, rest, connection, meditation, mindfulness, compassion, embodied movement, listening, reflection, art, prayer, etc. But this really offers the foundation for folks to be able to show up together and holds us in the process of long call leadership. Now, action, as we all know, you know, if it's not going to be enacted in our bodies, if it's not going to be enacted in our organizations and in our world, then if our values aren't going to match up with an actual embodied action, then we're not going to realize the world that we need. So that's liberatory leadership. Stop this share. So I want to take a pause there and open it up for any questions or reflections from your own work, from what I just shared in terms of liberatory leadership. Is this resonating? Is this making sense? Are you in total disagreement? Whatever is arising for you.
Hi, everybody. What's mostly arising for me right now is my 6-year-old struggle to go to bed, so I might be a little bit distracted until she's settled. But also just wanted to say, Yardena, that was resonating with me so much, and I think I especially appreciated the imagination piece of really freeing myself up to imagine and being with others to do that, to really support and nourish that. That I felt excited and energized hearing you describe that.
Thanks, Spring. We understand those babies. They just do not go on our timeline. Also pets, right? Anybody else have any reflections, insights? Like, yeah, like that's happening in my world right now or in my work.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Is this Vega?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Hi, Vega.
Love technology. I'm seeing it in everybody around me. Since I've been to the retreat, Liberation School, I've been really trying to be cognizant of what my body is telling me, how I feel, and that has meant in some instances I'm not going 100 miles per hour in the work, but everybody around me is. And I feel like I'm trying to like be the change that I'm seeking, but there's also a lot of guilt with that. And like right now, like I have housemates that are going out till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning caring for the homeless because we've had a freeze here and our city closed the only emergency walk-in shelter that housed 300. And so I see them as they come in and the trauma and everything, the stories that they're telling and the pace to which they're going. And so, yeah, this absolutely resonates. And it's like how we can continue to do the work when there's a sense of that urgency where, we had 2 people die from the cold. So that real urgency along with trying to create this new way of moving and practicing in our work.
Thank you, Vega, for bringing that up because it's so real. Absolutely. It is so real. Like it's not easy. And I think I also want to like offer up maybe just a bit of an analysis around trauma because I think that can help ground a little bit. So the way that trauma works is that when we experience a trigger or a traumatic event or, something that triggers a remembering of a traumatic event, if you imagine the body as kind of like a line like this, a horizontal line, then that is the kind of up moment. It's like the inhale of the breath, right? And so a lot of times in our movement work, we're living in the up here because we're responding to the trauma and the trigger. And then we experience that through in a vicarious way or a secondary way. We experience the trauma in our bodies and in our minds and in our psyches and our hearts, etc. And then the down, sometimes is the exhale, but sometimes it's the total collapse, right? The burnout. But there is a little bit of this, right? And so it's also like, it's finding the balance of sometimes we have to live in the up, sometimes we have to live here. Like that is why our bodies were created to be able to respond to trauma because there's trauma in our world. And for us humans, and especially like in this society, in the US and beyond, there's so much oppression. And so as change makers, we are going to be, showing up to that trauma. But then what often happens is that we get stuck here, and then adrenaline kicks in and then we only understand here. And it's the same kind of experience that, folks, addicts and alcoholics also experience, right? It's like the staying stuck place. But this kind of high level of response, what Vega was talking about, the go, 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 go. That's what capitalism wants us to do. That's what white supremacy wants us to do because it does disconnect us from ourselves. And yet we're like stuck here often and we can't get down because there's just the never ending trauma, the never ending death and denial of human bodies as important and Black bodies as, bodies. So it's a question for sure. How do we respond to this urgency that does exist? And yet our human bodies aren't actually made to live always here. Like we can't continue to live here. And we've seen this time and time again in our movements for change. I'm sure many of you have stories and experiences and maybe personal stories as well, of burnout, of overwhelm, of maybe even leaving altogether. I talk to so many folks who have been in movements for, decades and just had to leave, because they no longer knew what their place was. And I think one of the things that, I and like the work of Liberatory Leadership Project is really trying to present is that activism and organizing is much broader, that we should be broad in our understanding of like what exactly that is. And if it's trauma work, then how can we create real triage support and layered understanding of what's needed in that work? So we do need spiritual care before, the demonstration. We do need, the demonstration. We do need the during care that's happening, with the medic teams. We need the aftercare. And I'm just giving an example of a demonstration as an example of how this triage of support and care would look. But all of that is activism. All of that is part of organizing, and it sustains and creates sustainable movements. But instead what happens is that we're often responding constantly, again, because the crises are so many and so often. And it's painful to take ourselves out to take care of ourselves and take care of each other in order to take care and show up for long haul change. And yet, in part, it's because we're not doing that, sometimes we don't win as much as we could because we're all tired and burnt out and we're just holding all this grief and trauma within us. And there's no place for us to, to ground and funnel that. I just went on. Sorry about that. Anything else from folks around resonating or continuation on this point? What you feel or seeing in your organizations where you're struggling?
This is Rachel.
Go for it, Rachel.
Yeah, this all resonates really deeply with me and personally, and it's something that I fall short of often in my work. And I think this is, I come from a southwestern Pennsylvania, very interesting community. So this type of thing, I feel like the activist communities that I'm involved in are very resistant to any sort of spiritual language, or there's sort of a disconnect between, faith community people here and they're praying and that doesn't do anything. And, there's sort of a fragmentation, and I'm hopeful to hopefully quietly build a bridge and just invite people to be in spaces, find some common ground in these spaces. And that's been a challenge. It's been a challenge here. I hope to see that grow. And I know that it won't happen overnight. And, but this is really resonating with me. And it's something that I want to see more available to people in my community that are just really burned out. So I just wanted to reflect on how this resonates with me and how I'm frustrated and trying to find ways to apply it other than my own personal practices, but in a sense of community.
In the community way. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel. And Rachel's living in a rural area. So I think I just want to open it up for a moment if there are any folks who are also in rural communities or who have this experience of trying to integrate or kind of work at this edge and there's resistance. Anybody else have any shares around those intersections? No.
I can say something.
Okay. Who is this?
This is Bill.
Hi, Bill.
So first, I really appreciate the conversation about trauma. I really appreciate that. And my struggle has been more to integrate the social justice work into the spiritual practice. So I was part of a community that did a spiritual practice on dream work, and it was the more social justice part of it was well, no, you have to do the inner work, and it was kind of set up as the split. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to say that out loud, and I'm still kind of working on. I was really inspired by the Standing Rock movement because it was oh my God, they're asking everybody to do everything they do from a place of prayer. And I was wow, and they had a lot of space around what that meant. So yeah, I just wanted to share that and really appreciate conversation around trauma and what we're all dealing with, including a shooting right here in Montpelier today. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And you also do, I mean, you lift up like a really, important example of that coming together, I think, of healing and spirituality and justice, at Standing Rock, where there was a real intentional ask of everybody who entered into that space that we're going to start off with prayer, and that we're going to, be in ceremony and be in connection together, starting at 6 a.m. around the fire, the sacred fire that was burning all night long, and as, folks were gathered around that circle and a new person would arrive, the circle would get bigger and folks would be invited in. And then that was a space that was, people of color centered and led. And then there was also the space, and under, I think, like a seeing of like, there's going to be some white folks here, and where can they go? And having a place of decolonization meetings like every day, and folks really being encouraged to go there. And I saw this again at Mystic Soul this past weekend too, where it's a people of color centered space, and they have a space for white people to go to process, what's coming up for them, which can often be very different, and, isn't appropriate to bring in like people of color only spaces, right? So I think that like integration, seeing those multiple levels of like, what are all the multiple entries for folks to be able to build this movement for change in a way that does have a place for all of us and our skills and our talents, and is like sustaining us along the way. Does anybody else want to say anything about liberatory leadership before I move into oppression? And then we'll move into how to apply.
I guess it actually has to do with systems of oppression. This is Jenny in Oakland again. To speak to Rachel, your point of the resistance. So I live in an urban area, and I work with a group where we are actively looking at racial justice as white people and unlearning our racism. And we're mostly connected via yoga studios. And so even in a group where we are saying this is what we're doing, all of us are coming up against resistance, like internally and externally. Like, I think the systems are just so strong and so set that so I just wanted to let you know, even in cities, I'm experiencing this in myself and in other people that I'm working with, not feeling like we're doing enough if we're, sitting with more of a spiritual practice. So just wanted to let you know it happens here too, Rachel.
For sure. Good point, Jenny. Anybody else? Any folks from the phone have anything that they want to share out or ask?
Hey, this is Jess from Seattle. I just really want to appreciate this framework as a tool that brings together a lot of things that I've been thinking about and talking about with people in my community for a long time, but I really found in especially my past organizing project, which I left due to a lot of burnout and conflict that was so deeply seated and embedded and unresolved, that bringing these concepts was really delegitimized and not held as, really held in contrast to building power, and that there was a lot of tension around either there was kind of a dichotomous way of thinking around either you're committed to building power or you're committed to liberation, and those things being seen as separate. And yeah, deep tension I felt around those things was part of why I left. And so this just feels like such a gratifying and affirming tool and way of thinking about these concepts in concert with each other. Also curious if other folks have come up against that tension between power building and liberatory practice within our organizing communities.
Good question, Jess, and thank you for that share. Does anybody want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, it's Lynn. I just wanted to say, I really appreciate the model, partially because we're not building any time into most of our social justice work around actually taking time to reflect, to consolidate what happens, to learn from the experiences. It's kind of like do it and it fails or succeeds and then on to the next thing. And space to do that work is really precious. And I'm, about to start a bigger project. And, I said to people, look, it can't be just this brain trust in the room. We need to have a bigger conversation with various people in the community. And that's going to take some time. And, we can't just assume that we know what the answers are and go off and do it. And so that kind of holistic practice is part of how we give our space and ourselves space to actually remember and reflect and go, oh yeah, gee, we noticed the last 3 things that, yeah, maybe we should do more of this, maybe we should do less of this. And that's what I appreciate about how that model gives us a framework to actually name it and then try to practice it.
Thank you, Lynn. It also jogs in me this really important point, which is just who can really show up to movement work the way that it is done right now. And if we're not actually being accessible for folks with mental and emotional health needs and with differently abled bodies in the pace that we're doing things, it doesn't actually invite in folks who are very much at the margins, oftentimes with this pace. So thank you for that. Time is what I heard you say, Len, and it was so important. And also with popular education, although I'm not going to go into like the details of it, but within popular education, there is this cycle of like time of reflection of, okay, we've gathered from our communities, we've gathered from ourselves, possible solutions, we see patterns, we see relationships, and now let's reflect on like what's happened and then reintegrate and renew depending upon like what we've reflected on. And it's so true. And the earth teaches us, if we look to it, there are such cycles of rest and there's such cycles, in the seasons. There's so many moments, in the moon cycle, like, we just see so many examples of what it would look like to be in more sustained relationship with ourselves and our energy and our emotions and our spirit and just each other. And yet it's such a hard cycle to get out of because we're so entrenched in a system of oppression. Right. And then Jess, to go, back to your point in terms of like our other folks really grappling with this. And I know that folks are, because I'm like, worked with so many thousands of people who have like said the exact same thing you said, Jess. And I have so many examples of it myself. So I'm going to move to the systems of oppression worksheet, and then we'll probably cycle back around to that very point that you were making, Jess. So I'm going to go to screen share again. And the next one I'm going to pull up is the systems of oppression. And I'm not going to go over in depth. Okay. Sharing is paused. Resume share. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, great. All right, so I'm not going to go over in depth, but what we have here is a worksheet where we have several systems of oppression. Now, I'm not going to go into depth about what each system of oppression is. I mean, this is kind of like a beyond 101 workshop in terms of, we're just kind of like moving from a place of systems of oppression exist, and there are many of them. So I have several down here. They're not all encompassing. And then over on the right-hand side, what would it look like really to apply this model, liberatory leadership? What would it really look like to apply that to these things and how systems show up? So the first one I'm going to go over is white supremacy. And in the beginning of the workshop, I talked about the ways that systems of oppression show up inside of our bodies, and they show up inside of our organizations, and they show up in the world. And oftentimes how we understand and work with systems of oppression to dismantle them is just in the external, in the world. It's not in ourselves, in our bodies, and in our interpersonal relationships and in our organizations. However, there's a growing body of folks who are doing that work. And, I'm sure many of you also are very interested in that. And I know people are chatting, and I'm not looking at those chats. So I'm hoping maybe Amber can see those chats. If there's any technical things or anything, can let me know in a text message. So white supremacy, internalized systems, and some of these are external as well. But how does oppression show up? Okay, martyrdom. I have to give over everything. I have to give my body, my heart, my soul, my everything to this thing. Just give it all over. I'm not an important person. That we stigmatize mental, emotional, physical health as a private issue. So we just talked about that, a little bit briefly, but that we're not emotional beings, that we don't have, things that need attending to. Mired down with perfectionism and results in unrealistic timelines and deadlines, expectations. How does it look like externally in an organizational setting or interpersonally or inside of ourselves? A lot of tear down culture, separation from each other. We call each other out our mistakes and our faults, reinforcing hierarchy and power structures, devaluing and silencing the leadership experience and history of people of color, and tokenizing people of color and or generalizing people's experiences. Yes, and the worksheets can be sent out again. Great. I'm not frozen, am I? Y'all can see me? Okay, very good. Great. Okay, so how might we apply liberatory leadership to white supremacy? What would that look like? Practice. So if we applied practice to white supremacy, what would that look like? One thing, white folks are encouraged to know who they are. And I talk about white folks here because white folks are really disconnected. We as white folks are really disconnected from who we are. A lot of white folks will be like, I don't know what my culture is. And again, this is a real win on white supremacy's part, because if we don't know where we come from, then we're not examining, the ways that we've been a part of upholding much of this oppression. And when we also know where we come from, then we kind of know where we're going to. History is so important, ancestry and culture, and knowing where we come from and who we are. So there would be an encouragement of that. A vulnerability of staff, and that would be integrated in how we're meeting together, how we're talking, how we're building relationships together. A culture shift towards curiosity and learning from each other's mistakes and growing together instead of constantly calling each other out and putting each other down for not, doing something to perfection. And encouraging gratitude, compassion, and deep listening. So these are just some practices that can be incorporated that I've seen, and have worked with many people around in organizations around shifting culture from, a culture of oppression to a culture of inclusivity and liberation and love and real relationships being the center, and not the what isn't. And I think the second one I'm going to do is patriarchy. So that's on page 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe. Okay, so this is the second one I'll do, is patriarchy. So what does that look like? Well, for many of us, that looks like leadership looks a certain way, and it's a charismatic leader. And if we're not showing up that way, then we feel really like we're not leading, or we're not contributing in the ways that we might otherwise. There's a decentering of the importance of process. Process isn't important. And there's a belief that change happens individually. So a real disconnection with the collective. And then externally, how does it show up? It looks like unequal power structures and hierarchical models that disempowers the large majority of people mostly affected by systems of oppression. It looks like marginalizing the experience of folks based on race, class, ability, sexuality, and gender. And it devalues emotional labor and the time and attention spent on group dynamics or processes and domestic and physical needs such as food, childcare, personal breaks, cycles of engagement. So what would it look like if we applied liberatory leadership to this with the imagination? This looks like, and again, these are all examples of things that really have happened and do happen. So I'm pulling from real life. But institutions with power leveraging resources and relationships support, sustain, and eventually equalize power with smaller organizations, collectives, and projects. How many of us have these organizations or these things where folks are doing very similar work or have like similar platforms or whatnot, and we're not like pooling together the resources, you know, because of all the competition that exists? What would it really look like to stack our resources, which comes from permaculture, this idea of stacking in a small kind of environment? How can we, you know, have as many plants and things that are working together in a small kind of small environment work together? So how can institutions that have a lot of power, have a lot of relationships, have much more resources, how can they really leverage with smaller institutions, which often, you know, are found in rural areas, found in southern communities, found in, you know, and have huge impacts for the people that live there, but don't have access to, you know, maybe the education to write the grant that's going to get them the money or the relationships to get them in the door, right? Second point, to build collective leadership structures that value leadership styles across culture, race, gender, sexuality, and ability. Worker-led hybrid structures that create sustainable-based products or service to help fund action-oriented change-making work. So really like stepping outside of the nonprofit industrial complex and figuring out what is a different way. And there's a huge, you know, upsurge of cooperatives and worker-led, you know, structures that have been happening, you know, for many decades. But, you know, I'm definitely like seeing a lot more in terms of cooperative building being more mainstream. And organizational sabbaticals with varying lengths depending on personal and work responsibilities and pressures. So really like valuing folks, you know, giving people real time off. So I'm going to stop there. Okay, thanks Spring for showing the link for the worksheets. And those worksheets are downloadable. So there's a link to each workshop and then you can just download them to your computer. And I'll resend them out again with the recording. So take a pause there. Any of this resonating with folks? Do folks have examples of ways systems of oppression have been showing up in your organizations, in your work? Now's the time.
Sure, I'll give you a quick example. Both in my organization and partner organizations, we are regularly hiring workers of color, Indigenous workers. And, you know, the official line is, yes, we want you to come in and bring your skill sets and your views. And, but the white culture doesn't change. And so then when, you know, those skill sets and views are brought forth, there's just an inevitability that then, you know, they are, you know, not rewarded, ostracized, you know, demonized, etc. And it's just a continual practice that I see in many organizations, you know, NGO organizations within Canada. And, you know, it's about naming that white culture and then trying to, you know, at least be aware that it's there and try to, you know, resist that same pattern. Because I'm just, you know, I'm seeing this now over about a 20-year period. We just keep doing the same thing. And it's just, you know, the waste of talent and the trauma that we're creating is just not okay.
Yes. Can folks relate to this? Mm-hmm.
This is Amber. Yeah, I that really resonates with me. An organization that I used to organize for and be a part of. Yeah, that was really present, and the way that manifested was uh, there was a lot of talk around like um, the sharing of power. You know, like, oh, this is a community-driven organization. This is a organization that values and puts people of color in the front of the room. And yeah, lots of times the people of color were put in the front of the room, but very rarely were they really given any power um, in a way that that would impact the organization. So, like, for example, you could come and be a volunteer, but you really you weren't at the board meetings talking about how the money was being spent. Your name was in a grant application, but again, like, you really didn't have any say over where those dollars were going. Was it really going into your community in a way that you felt comfortable? So yeah, that really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm. Did anybody have any examples of things like that and ways that the organization shifted or changed, or the group or network like was able to respond to some of those ways that oppression was showing up? I'll share a story. So I worked with an organization for several years, really well-respected social justice organization that did amazing work, and folks who, participated in what this organization offered, were transformed, and then internally it was very different. It was a multiracial organization, and it was very multiracial, but there was a lot of racial dynamics within the organization that were not really being addressed. And folks of color, especially, were saying, like, we're burning out, like we have the heavier workload, we are traumatized at a different level. And then we're given, the work of working with traumatized populations at a different level. And so then that's just, creating these conditions that are just unhealthy, and just can't continue to show up with it. And exactly what Amber was just lifting up in terms of the money thing, which it often happens in financial, behind the scenes, like what's happening in the finances is only available to, the operations staff or the director, oftentimes who are white. And this organization, really resisted any kind of discussion around integrating any kind of healing or spiritual approaches to like how they were doing the work. And the organization had a financial crisis, which involved, someone, the operations director, basically embezzling funds, like a large amount of funds from the organization. And in this like moment of crisis that was, really real for like the operating of the organization, but also for, just this like huge example of, revealing the dynamics and the ways that oppression was showing up racially. But it was so interesting, because then what the organization did is that they said, oh, well, now we really recognize that we actually do need healing. Like, we do actually need to like go deep and to do some racial healing work. And it was like the very thing that they had been resisting like all of this time. It's oftentimes like the crises that like, holds up the mirror for folks. But then in the crisis, like, what do we turn to, right? It's like the very thing that folks were like asking for all along. Like, we need healing. We need to take time to really go deep into why our organization is operating in this way internally, and then externally is operating in this other way. And it was a huge shift for the organization because they took the time. We took the time. I was part of the organization at the time. We took the time, and it took many years of time, and really went into that racial healing process together, that involved, weekly work. And there was like a white, and a people of color, like healing, caucusing group that was happening like at separate times. And, but just invested in that, like in a way that I haven't seen like very many organizations do. But what has shifted and changed because of that work that they did is like dramatically different. I mean, their internal structures and their internal staffing looks so much different than it did when I was there. And I know that in part it was because of that attention to healing, and a nurturing, of the pain and oppression and the trauma that existed within the organization. So that's my story, Jess, that, in terms of, what you had brought up earlier. And, I think sometimes we can live in the critique and seeing all of what's wrong. And there is so much wrong, and there's so much that is telling, even organizations, I mean, including how they're getting funded most of the time, to save face and to not tell the truth and not to be authentic really in how folks are operating, and I know that also, exists for, healing, institutions and healing practitioners. There's so much about systems of oppression that are asking us to really show up as only a partial self, because there's this great fear that if we reveal our mistakes, that we reveal our inadequacies, our humanness, our failures, are the ways that, we're not living up to the liberatory, processes and values that we say that we're about oftentimes, then we will be, irrelevant or unaccepted, So take a pause there. Are there other stories or challenges that folks are dealing with right now that are really grappling with in terms of your own work or your life, in terms of the ways that systems of oppression are showing up? Any folks on the phone who want to jump in? I heard a small click.
I have a question. This is Jackie in New Orleans. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. I mean,
Okay, Jackie, we can no longer hear you. We could hear you, and then all of a sudden you went on mute. But there you are.
oh, hi.
Hi.
But I mean, I have a question about doing this kind of work within spaces that have not historically welcomed it. And, to employ a shared power process, or what you're calling a liberatory process, into spaces that have benefited from white supremacy, but propose to be otherwise. So I'm speaking directly to healing spaces, yoga spaces, etc., that talk about liberation, but are generally homogenous and white. And if you or anyone on this call has experience or success in doing that, because mine has been predominantly resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Good question. Okay, so for the yoga folks, for the people who have been trying to shift and change the Western yoga industrial complex, of which I know there are some folks on the call. I'm happy to speak on it too, but maybe I'll offer it up.
Hello, this is Rachel again, and this is an area where I actually felt more movement than in the activist communities that I'm involved in, and partly because most of the work I do is trauma work with yoga. So most of the spaces that I've been in that I teach regularly in include prison, rehab, shelter. That's completely changed my language and how I teach and how I use language in terms of my public classes. I also I live in a neighborhood that's very diverse. Even though I'm in a rural community, I live in like the urban sort of little enclave in the community, and have made my home studio contribution based. So the people that are coming to my class, we're doing, Dharma talk, we're doing writing, and I'm not attracting the numbers that some of the studios attract that are more physically oriented to the practice, and I think it's taken the space of about 4 years for that to happen, that people are coming to this practice because this is what they want. I have had people show up and not return because it hasn't been what they wanted. And again, for me, it has to be not about numbers, but about relationships in the space I'm creating and what I want people to, the kind of community here that can be nurturing to people. And I do end up getting people that I've taught while they were incarcerated and in rehab showing up at my house, which is perfect. So that's sort of how that's evolved here for the practice. It's sort of changing the language, changing the way that I'm presenting it in the community and offering it contribution based.
Thanks, Rachel. Jenny, did you want to jump in? You don't have to.
I know I do. I really hear you, Jackie. My immediate answer when you're like, has anyone had success? I'm like, no. And then I sit back and I think about that. And I think, I guess my approach to the work is so relational, so personal process based. So the way I'm looking at it goes very like individual to students, to other teachers. But as far as like, for example, a place that I teach talks about their whole mission statement is inclusivity. And so I really resonate because it's not an inclusive space at all.
Yeah.
And I, without going into a whole story, I don't feel a lot of hope for that place. But like, for example, next week I'm going to do some work with another yoga studio, with a co-facilitate with a Black male who wants to help them look at their racism and why Black students aren't feeling safe in the space. So there's like tiny little things happening, but as far as like organizational structures and businesses, my initial answer is like, I don't have good examples, and I'm sure they're out there. I just, even in the Bay Area, like I'm not that aware of many of them. So I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I kind of hear two things in there. One is like just specifically, how do you kind of crack this open in a group of white people, which I feel like that's like, there's like whole organizations and movements around that. Like, how do you get white people to face this, right? And I think there's like a lot of really useful facilitation approaches there. But just in terms of like, I'm interested in this specific example of the like yoga practice. One thing that we're experimenting with right now, and so far just the conversations that I've had have been good. I don't know if the events will be good, but one thing that we're experimenting with is we have like a very active local Dalit resistance movement, which is like basically like caste oppression like the Untouchable cast, if people are familiar with that, right? They have like an amazing resistance movement in Indian American communities. And so one of the things that that they wanted to do was have an educational session about the history of yoga and the history of like Brahmin oppression of Dalit people, and like basically kind of bring in that like history of, because really one of the things that's like frustrating, at least for me, with yoga communities is the cultural appropriation, right? But like a part of the way we can begin to heal areas where there's been a lot of cultural appropriation is to just like learn that history. So that's something that we're experimenting with. And I do find that like people are actually quite open to learning about history, including people who are like kind of hypocritical about inclusivity. They will at least like, they do want to learn about history, you know, and then that's kind of a conversation starter of like, wow, I didn't know about that. Wow, how can we do this differently? Wow, how are we you know, like, how are we replicating the original history of oppression that's associated with this practice?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kelly. Yep, such a good point. I think oftentimes, you know, we find this in faith and spiritual communities as well, and in social justice communities. Like, oftentimes folks don't, like, if we have like a material thing, you know, like a book or an article or something, like we're going to have a study group or something like that. And I think about your work, Jenny, where you did exactly that, which was have, you know, a study group of white folks like exploring, like, how do we really show up in a more decolonized, you know, anti-oppression way in the yoga world, in the Western yoga world context. But when we have that, then it feels a little bit less like personal. And then in that exploration, you recognize and realize like how personal it is and how connected we are to, you know, upholding those systems of oppression. But sometimes we need that like little extra thing that's a little bit outside of ourselves to be able to like go deeper. So really good points. You know, and there's a ton of like resources out there, Jackie, around, and I'm sure you probably know about many of them, but decolonizing spirituality, and you know, the group Beyond Duality on Facebook, and you know, lots of practitioners, Jacoby Ballard, and lots of folks who are like working at the intersections of anti-oppression and yoga, and really trying to, you know, break open that conversation. And I think it's just about like finding the allies, you know, which is basic organizing, right? It's like building the relationships. It's like finding the allies, finding where there's movement, where there's interest, and like going there. And maybe it's a light touch, and it's not like the deep dive that we so want to, you know, inside out in organization. Maybe it's a very light thing that happens. You know, I think about Knoxville, Tennessee, when I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is a fairly like small town, and how resistant the white, you know, yoga community was to really going into how are we replicating systems of oppression? How are we culturally appropriating by teaching this practice? And, you know, oftentimes it was just like the general like one-on-one conversations that would then deepen into something else that sometimes we don't know what the seeds that we're planting are. And I think in our movement work too, we're often, and this really goes back to the point that Barbara was talking about, we often don't know what is the results of our work, and we so rarely see the victories or experience those like in real tangible ways. And that can feel hopeless at times, but it's so important to, you know, to just continue to plant those seeds, because that is what's going to grow. This imagination, like the imagination of the world that we need, you know, the beloved community, and, you know, a world where justice and liberation is central. Okay, I want to veer from this for one moment. We're going to do our final worksheet, and we're going to just take a moment to spend a little bit of time with it and share out any questions or reflections. And then we're going to close with a practice to integrate our learnings before we head out for the evening. So let me pull up the final worksheet, which is called Applying Liberatory Leadership. Okay, try that again. Screen share. Okay, so the final worksheet, it's called Applying Liberatory Leadership, and it's just a completely and totally blank worksheet. But you can write in it. So you can use this right now, or you can just use your notebook. But I just want you to take a moment and reflect on what is a project, issue, or organization that you would like to reflect a little bit on. And then we have the different parts of the model: community, earth and or spirit, imagination, practice and action. And then there's another little block here that says where action and practice meet. And it's just kind of like going deeper into that real question of like, how does the how meet the what? So how do our values are really embodied in our organizations or in our work, our projects, and our relationships? And let's spend some time like maybe just picking a few of these and kind of listing out like what's currently happening, you know, in regards to community in this project, issue, or organization. And then like how might you integrate a little bit more community focus into that to integrate and apply more liberation. So I'm going to hold this up here for just another moment. And I also want to ask you to integrate the visualization a little bit in terms of what was that time that you really felt like you were showing up as your full self, what was available to you, and like getting into that feeling place of like, what would it really look like? What would it really feel like, you know, to have community in this thing? Like, what's the current situation and how could it be integrated more? So finally, I'll tell the instructions one more time for folks who are on the phone. So it's like identifying what's a project, issue, or organization that you want to apply liberatory leadership, just kind of see how that might work. And then the different components of liberatory leadership were community, earth and or spirit, imagination, practice, and action. So what's the current situation? How are these things currently showing up? And then how might they be integrated more? So we're going to take a few minutes to do that. And I really, yeah, we'll just take a few minutes. Just take about another minute. Okay. Wrap up your thought. I really want to spend some time on some solutions, because the last thing we did was really talk a lot about, how systems of oppression are showing up. And, another amazing thing about systems of oppression and how, that culture shows up is that we spend a lot of time in critique in a lot of the ways that, we're failing and we're not doing good. And it's, oftentimes a big leap to step in that imagination place, but I'm asking us to do that, and each of you have such deep wisdom from your own experiences and the ways that you've been showing up into movements for change. So I just love to share out some of those. What's possible, or maybe what's already happening in terms of applying a liberatory leadership model to our movements and to our healing work. I want to encourage folks who haven't maybe shared to share. I'm not going to call on anybody, but big invitation.
I can share kind of a small recent example. As Jackie and Jenny started talking about yoga organizations, I was smiling because at first what you were saying fit so much for my setting, which is academia, which seems really different in some ways, but what you're saying is so true about sort of who we say we are and what we say we're working towards, and that we're progressive and that we hold equity as one of our top values. We've been getting training and coaching and working to transform for equity for about 2.5 years. And we're really just very recently talking about what it means to share power and how to take real steps to reflect that, and getting a lot of feedback from people of color who are more recent hires over the past year in our organization that it doesn't feel real, that we're saying one thing and not yet living it. And so my small example that does feel hopeful, and it's what came up for me first in the visualization, is a few days ago, I asked my big boss, who is also a white woman, there are 4 of us who are white women who have held the power in the organization for a long time. And we had a really kind of damaging interaction earlier in the week, last week, about sharing power, where the big boss kind of came in and disrupted community. And so I asked her if I could share feedback, and she said yes. And I gave her just a different kind of, I think, honest and loving feedback from a centered place myself rather than a reactive and critical place. And she also gave me feedback, which surprised me. And I just felt more connected than I had in a really long time. So that was encouraging to just think about it as one one real interaction at a time and see where it goes from there.
Thank you for that example, Spring. That is so important, and it reminds me, and maybe some of you have heard me tell this story before, but it reminds me of this question I asked Zenju Earthland Manuel, who is a Black Buddhist nun out of the Bay Area, and just an amazing person. She wrote The Way of Tenderness, which is a beautiful book. If you are in spirituality at all, you should definitely read this book. And I had asked her this question. I said, I struggle sometimes so much. It feels like, with other white people at times, like folks don't want to have the conversation around like anti-racism or how to really, be in this be in an anti-racist journey. And she said, my question to you is, what is your agenda? Do you have an agenda of love? Or do you have an agenda of trying to convince somebody of something? And that really changed my approach and how I show up to people. And just really appreciate what you said, Spring, because when we come from this place of loving and not a place of separateness, they're I got it figured out, but you do not. Something different happens. So thank you. Other folks?
So, Art House is a little bit, we live in community, and we're also working outside the community. And I think that one of the areas that I think we do better at the community out there sometimes than the community internally, if that makes sense, because we're doing so much outside work. So one of the things that we're trying to focus on is to try and build that community up inside the house so that we can also better represent it outside the house. So that's just one thing that came up as I was thinking about it, because I was like, oh, we do community really well, but then it's always going deeper. And then another area, and I know it seems odd, but my new motto is that I'm not doing any direct action unless it makes me laugh. And that has resulted in community building, as we do art builds where we made a replica porta potty to deliver to the mayor's house at 7 o'clock in the morning, because it's really tragic that a human being died in a porta potty here in St. Louis because of, the closing the shelter. But the joy of making it, conceptualizing it, that kind of grounding of that, a bunch of people getting together, and then the joy of actually delivering it and being mischievous in that. And so I think that is something that I would like to try and integrate a little bit more, is how do we have joy in our direct actions? How do we infuse, because that also brings about connection.
Thank you, Vega. So such important part, such important pieces is that joy and celebration. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more person if someone else wants to lift up something, or if someone has a question.
I can relate, Spring, to the academia thing. I'm also in the academic world, and I think that we know intellectually so much about different leadership styles, and but it's also it's very patriarchal. And I've been thinking, since I went to that conference that Yardena was talking about, the Mystic Soul Conference last weekend, and one of their rules of life is subvert, not react. And I've been thinking about that in terms of, even in that conversation about how to make spaces like yoga the yoga worlds sort of a little bit more collective or sharing the power or something in some way. I often see it in these big ways that can never happen. And I'm just this little person at a major university, and how am I going to do anything? And I feel like the starting in small little subverted ways that aren't reactive, but that are kind of what you were saying, Ardina, like grounded in some kind of practice of care and love, not just like the self-righteousness that I tend toward. And I think acknowledging that has been helpful. And also just kind of softening and finding little ways that are like little gentle ways of subversion that feel like they can really change the culture of a place. And I think that can be really liberatory, even just being a little bit more vulnerable with the people I work with. I think has really changed how I feel about the structure of it.
Thank you, Carrie. And I feel like this has been a bit of a theme tonight, in terms of like, what are the small ways that can like add to the larger ways. And if you haven't read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, I highly recommend it. But she talks a lot about that. And I think in our organizing communities and also just in the world, when we have so much oppression and pain, it can feel really overwhelming. But that there's like a both and, like it does start with ourselves. You know, our sites, our bodies are sites for so much pain and so much liberation. And we can learn so much by going in here, you know, spiritually, emotionally, physically. But then also like, you know, in the ways that we're in front of people, you know, just like every day that there's a moment to shift and change something. And that is also part of, you know, the larger action and movement, that it's all a part of movement. And then maybe we need to expand our definition also of like, what does it mean really to show up in movements for change? And like, what does activism look like? And what is our role? And how can we really play an important part in all of that? And I think it's like in the smallest moments and in the largest moments, right? And then the in between, but that they're all of value. And so thank you. So if there's other questions, I will be sending out an email tonight or tomorrow with the recording, and feel free to email me with any additional questions that are coming up for you around the content of tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Amber for closing practice, and then I want to make a small announcement, Amber, after the practice around our next workshop. Okay.
Well, first off, I just want to thank you, Ardina, for leading this amazing workshop, and thank you to all of you for participating and opening up during our time together. So we spent this call talking a lot about imagination, right? And to Carrie's point, sometimes it can be very difficult and overwhelming to think about changing these huge structures and oppressive entities that have been in place, you know, long before we were here. So in the spirit of imagining, I'd like us to take just a minute or two, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, lower your eyes. And rather than think about the big, I want us to take a few breaths and imagine a world where there is abundance. Imagine a world where the myth of scarcity has been exposed, where we have found the answer, the antidote to oppression, white supremacy, patriarchy. And rather than trying to verbalize the structure of that world, I want you to take out a piece of paper after you've taken these breaths and have some reflection, and write down how we engage with this, how this world feels, what it looks like. So what does it look like visually? What does it sound like? What does it taste like? Just use all of your senses to imagine this amazing world, the product of our labor, the product of our movements. When you're ready, you can open your eyes. And again, write down, what does that world taste like, feel like, sound like, look like? A world where there is abundance, where we have found the antidote to oppression. We'll just take a few minutes. And as you finish, if you are on video, just, begin to look up so I know that you're finished. In my world, we stretch all day. All right. So is there anyone that would like to share? You hear from a few folks? I know there's a lot of imagination on this call.
Cotton candy.
I was just about to say Skittles. I do not know why.
It's because they're both colorful and sweet. Others who'd like to share?
Hi, I'll share. That world feels like it's in slow time, which feels really good. And it feels like a block party. There's lots of smells of different foods cooking. And yeah, there's drumming and dancing and there's babies. So that's what showed up. It was really beautiful and lovely. Thank you for that invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Can we hear from maybe 2 more people? Is there anyone on the phone that would like to share?
This is Sarah from Minneapolis. What kept on coming up for me was this idea of enough, just enough, and enough being not only in the abundance of love and resources and all of this, but this idea that we are enough.
Thank you for that. Do we have one more person?
Laura's thinking that I should share too. I'll just say that I was smelling really clean air, like after it rains, and I was hearing sounds of the natural world along with sounds of people in the cities. And I was picturing everybody kind of glowing, consistent with what you just said about everyone being enough, really feeling enough, that they have the love that they need, and feeling seen and recognized in the world as inherently beautiful and brilliant and whole.
Thank you, Spring. And thank you all for going on that short journey with us. And I'm going to pass it back to Yardana for announcements.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to give a big thanks. Thank you, Amber, so much. I do not know why Skittles, but it was just like the first thing that came. My childhood favorite candy. Thank you all so much for sharing, for being present, for showing up, for the inquiry, for the questions, for your belief in the intersections of spirituality, healing, and justice. And I just wanted to share real quick that we do have another workshop. It's in February. It's the 15th of February, and it's called The Energetic Embodiment of White Supremacy, Healing Our Bodies. And it's with Tada Husimi, they are a queer Japanese body worker, and they do a lot of work around trauma and the way that trauma shows up in the body, and has a really different perspective in terms of where we carry trauma and how that shows up, and how we can address it. So that we can show up as more prepared in our movements, building our movements for change, and in our liberation work. So I will post that in the chat, and I'll also put that in our email address as well, in our email that I send out. I can't talk anymore. It's like past my bedtime. Okay. I'm sorry. I'll put that in our email that we send out to you all. But big thanks and so much love and appreciation to each of you. And everybody can unmute themselves and do a very loud goodbye. Good night. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good
Love,
night.
love, love. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. That's so sweet. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Spring. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.